there's a difference between an initiative and a referendum, and I'm rather less sceptical about referendums. An initiative is where a group of individual voters can get together to force a referendum to be held in favour of a particular proposal that the people making up the initiative themselves have put together. So they get to decide what the question is, and they then get it onto the ballot by themselves. A referendum is where elected representatives either decide to or have to refer some question that they've already decided their own opinions on to the people in a vote. So, for example, you could have a system where certain changes, typically constitutional changes, have to be referred to the people to be ratified. Or there's a possibility of certain laws being referred to the people for their decision. So initiative and referendum are actually different things. And my scepticism is largely about initiative. The starting point for me in this discussion is the tension that there is in this party between two traditions that we stand for. One is a tradition of constitutionalism, and the other is a tradition of populism. And you can see the constitutionalism in our belief in separation of powers, in limited government, in checks and balances. Two houses of parliament, both should be elected, of course, unlike the present, but having different roles, deliberately set up to get in one another's way, so that decisions can't be taken too quickly, can't be taken on a whim, and protects the rights of minorities and unpopular groups. That's on the one side, there's constitutionalism, which is fundamental to our political thinking, and has been for a very long time. On the other hand, there's community politics, which is fundamentally an invitation to populism. It's the idea that not enough people are taking part in politics, which I think is true, more people should take part, that there's a growing gap between those bureaucrats in the town hall who just decide things according to their own whim, and us, the people, who should be more involved in making decisions. And like most people in this party, I believe in both of those things. I believe both in the constitutionalism and in the populism. And for the large part, we tell ourselves that they are compatible with one another. And we tell ourselves they're compatible because we say, well, if populist movements threaten to violate minority rights, then the courts can step in and protect those minorities. But actually, I've come to the conclusion that that's a bit optimistic, that there's a real tension here. That if you adopt a populist point of view, and then expect the courts to protect individuals, what you then generate are populist campaigns against the judges, populist campaigns against the rule of law itself. And we've seen precisely that in New Labour. Precisely those campaigns that you see on the front page of the Daily Telegraph about interfering judges and lawyers getting in the way of the will of the people. And just imagine what if you had a referendum to bring back the death penalty, which the courts then struck down as contrary to the Human Rights Act. What would then happen? You would then have a campaign to abolish the Human Rights Act and to get rid of judicial power. So there is a serious tension there. And there's also tension in the effect of a great deal, an excess of direct democracy on elected representatives, that it takes away their responsibility to take decisions. And they think, well, I can get away with not deciding because people will decide. You have to be wary of that problem as well. And I suppose the third thing is that what part of our constitutionalism is the belief that all power should be accountable. And one of the problems in initiative systems is the people who start up the initiatives and get them going, get them on the ballot, they're not accountable for anything they do. It struck me as rather odd over the last decade or so, the growing use of the word politician to describe a separate group of people in our society. Very obvious. When I was growing up many, many years ago, people would talk about typical Labour, typical Tory, occasionally typical Liberal if we were lucky. But people had their stereotypes about the parties. But a stereotype about all people involved in politics, I think that's quite new. And I think that is part of the disengagement, the separation. When people talk to me about politicians, I say, well, we're a democracy, so we're all kind of politicians to some degree. So you're obviously describing yourself. But people don't have that view of politics. There's politics and then there's life. And that is a problem. Though it does strike me that having citizen initiative doesn't necessarily make that situation any better. In fact, it can make it worse. It can make the gap between the elected representatives and the people even more stark if you have a system where the people can say to the elected representatives, we don't care what you think, we're going to do this our way. I suppose the question is, what would you do instead? There are many more ways of getting people involved than initiatives and just consulting people. One thing remember about this country is we have a remarkably low number of elected representatives. There are very few councils per head of population. Whenever people propose having more councils, somebody says, oh, it's an extra layer of bureaucracy. Well, it's not, it's an extra layer of democracy. And somehow we've got ourselves into the mindset that having elections and representatives is a bad thing, but it's a good thing. And local democracy itself, representative democracy, is actually a school in responsibility, in taking responsibility for public decisions. And having to decide public questions on behalf of other people, that I think is a serious way of re-engaging people, as opposed to simply voting referendums where people just vote on their own interests. That's all I was going to say, but given what Diana said, I suppose I might go in a little more detail as to why I'm sceptical about initiatives. First thing to mention is minority rights. It's true that sometimes countries that operate on the basis of initiative do indeed pass initiatives which are liberal. I'm afraid the evidence is the other way. It's a well-known finding in political science that, on the whole, only 1/3 of initiatives succeed, 2/3 fail. And there's an interesting reason for that, we might mention later. But if you look only at initiatives that attack minority groups, about gay rights, about racial minorities, 3/4 of those succeed. And there is, I think, in the initiative process an inherent degree of reactionary politics. When you talk to people in America about initiatives, one of the things they say is one reason we want this is it gets politicians out of the way. The special interests control the state legislature. So what we want instead are initiatives where we control, the people control what happens rather than special interests. What that fails to take into account is the special interests control initiatives. In fact, a lot of initiatives are proposed by special interests in the first place. Although actually a lot of those fail, that's why only 1/3 of them get through. But nevertheless, the special interests, the rich and powerful groups in society, it gives them an extra tool to get round the elected politicians. And when it comes to preventing progressive change, the special interests are even more successful. One thing they're really good at is stopping initiatives going through which might affect their interests. They can pay for vast media campaigns. And just imagine having initiatives in this country with our centralised, controlled, monopolised reactionary media. Now, what do you think is going to happen there? Is that going to be a change of progressive direction? Final thing to mention is about budgeting. If you do budgets item by item and not as a coherent whole, you end up with irrational incoherence. You cannot do anything to do with the heart of real policy making, which is what the money gets spent on, where the tax comes from, by this method at all. It simply can't be done. And the evidence again, this is my final point, the evidence again from the US is very clear on this. States that use initiatives have lower broad-based taxes, like income taxes, higher user charges on users of services, and greater public debt than the states that don't.